All right, welcome back to AJ507, and we are in chapter 12, and this is going to be part two. And we're going to start off with use of force. Now, the use of force is legal and sometimes necessary, or a necessary element, if you will, of correctional supervision. And most observers say that the serious abuse that occurred in the past, things like, and these are kind of terms, if you will, what we call tune-ups or that Tucker telephone thing, and I'll show you what that is, really don't take place today. So these are kind of interesting, different things that happened, yes, a long time ago. And we'll kind of show what those might actually be. So by definition, a tune-up was what was kind of a lesson taught to inmates by Texas prison guards, and that's what they called them way back when, right? That involved, let's say, verbal humiliation, profanity, shoves, kicks, slaps, or even something called a blackjack or a baton or a sap, S-A-P, sap. So this would be a blackjack. It had a strap, and this is what the inmate would be hit with. And this is what they call a sap. And you'd put your hand through here and you'd hold it here. And this part was filled with like sand or something similar. Okay, so that would be the phrase tune-up. And then early on, the Tucker telephone, that was an electrical device that was attached to the genitals of an inmate to deliver shocks, kind of like torture. And this was used back in Arkansas. And again, this was a long time ago. But you can't just kind of say that this didn't happen, right? So these are kind of forms of torture, etc., that occurred in an Arkansas prison, etc. And again, we're talking a long time ago, but they still took place. So there really is no doubt, right, that prisons were extremely or more brutal in past decades. Now, ironically, as violence by officers decreased, okay, in the late 1970s and 1980s, it opened the door to the violence of inmate gangs and cliques. So let me kind of back up and say that again, right? As prisons were, they started off extremely brutal, and we know that in past decades, but as that particular violence by officers decreased in the 70s, the late 70s and 80s, we also started to see an increase in violence among inmates in the form of gangs and cliques. And in the 1980s, inmates had less to fear from correctional staff, but more to fear from one another, as racial gangs and powerful cliques inside of the prison systems, etc., began to form, and individuals kind of solidified, if you will, their control over kind of prison black markets, right? So they would deal drugs and cigarettes and different things like that, and they would actually run kind of a black market type thing. And there was a time in the 1970s and 1980s when officers described some prisons as basically out of control. There were prisons where correctional officers were afraid to walk into certain areas, the living units, the living quarters. And, inmates literally controlled some parts of the prisons. Now, we know that that can't happen, but we also know that we can't go back to the brutal ways of how we used to run prisons, etc., kind of a long time ago. So today prisons are really not as violent, but there are, unfortunately, sometimes, there will be some illegal uses of force that still occur. All right, and I gave you a couple of, different photos of some different prison gangs, etc., that you can kind of take a look at. But these are some of the cliques. But again, today prisons are not as violent as they were, but incidents of excessive force still happen. And, again, as I said, inmates have more to fear from each other than from correctional officers. But here you can see you have prison riot in Soledad that leaves 8, injured. Riot at Tehachapi State Prison. So these things do happen. And, you know, beatings of inmates who attack other correctional officers are what they kind of refer to as utilitarian. They serve as a warning to other inmates that they will receive similar treatment if they attack a CO. And officers might also defend the actions on what we would call retributed grounds, because the inmate would probably not be punished for the attack through any legal channels. Now, again, these are, dilemmas, right? Because you don't want to go back to the old way that we used to do things. And of course, you don't want to arbitrarily use force unless it falls within policy and you're justified. Okay. But I just wanted to show you that there are assaults on prison guards, just like there are on police officers in the field. So, here we have one of each. 4 inmates facing charges for beating corrections officer, prison guards accused of beating inmate. So there's this kind of issue that goes on in there, right? So we want to make sure that we're doing things professionally and ethically, but also safely. So how do you maintain this morality, if you will, then in prisons? How can you actually do that? So, correctional officers report that they experience a great deal of stress and stress-related, illnesses. Things like hypertension are common among officers, as well as social problems like alcoholism and even divorce. And some reports indicate that these problems exist in higher numbers with correctional officers than they do even with police officers. And correctional officers, they feel criticized and even scorned by so many. So it's little wonder that they adapt to their role by sometimes unethical and, even egotistic patterns of behavior. Yet it is important to understand the consequences of, such actions or these types of, positions, if you will. So without a strong moral and ethical code, correctional officers may find themselves drifting into kind of what we call relativistic egoism. Behavior that benefits the individual is acceptable despite the long-term effect or inconsistencies with their duty and their personal value systems. So again, it's tough, right? Working in these areas, maintaining this morality in a kind of a, coercive environment really is no simple task. So that need for a strong moral and ethical code is definitely there. And we already talked about the term relativistic egoism. That's behavior that benefits the individual. It's acceptable despite the long-term effects or inconsistencies with their duty and their own, personal value system. So we've talked a lot about, correctional officers. Well, what about jail officers? Well, really, and remember, correctional, we're talking about prison systems. And typically jail officers, we're talking about county jail facilities or local jails. So little has been written about jail officers who may be sheriff's deputies completing their assignment at the jail before being moved to street patrol. And sometimes jail officers are street deputies who are transferred back to the jail as even a punishment. So maybe they did something that they shouldn't have done on patrol, etc., whatever that is, and now they're being shipped back to the jail. And that's kind of looked at sometimes as a punishment. And in other situations, jail officers are not sworn deputies with a kind of a separate title. They might be called custody officers, etc. And sometimes that's even lower pay. So that's, kind of another thing that those officers have to contend with. Now, in many respects, local jail officers have more difficult responsibilities than those state prison officers, because jail population is extremely transitory and often unstable. Offenders may come into jails that jail facility intoxicated, suffering from undiagnosed diseases or some type of psychiatric condition, or even be suicidal. So, again, there's a lot of different things. And jail officers deal with individuals who are experiencing maybe despair and anxiety over the legal issues. And sometimes they have to be constantly alert to the possibility of, like I said, suicide. Um, so there's a lot of differences between the jail officer and the state prison officer. And, the constant activity and kind of chaotic environment of a jail environment create a kind of a unique ethical dilemma. Many jail inmates, especially with mental illness, they can't or they just won't follow the rules. So with that being said, jail officers tend to deal with that troublesome type behavior as kind of a discipline issue, which can kind of get them into trouble a little bit, right? Um, and you kind of talk about it here is while you look at a couple of different restraint chairs that they have in some of these jail facilities, is throwing, let's say, feces a behavioral problem or an indication of mental illness? And sometimes it's both. So here's kind of an example that I'm giving you. When the person is placed in isolation, um, the situation may bring on things like hallucinations, anxiety attacks, distorted thinking. Mental ill inmates are more likely to be charged with rule violations, including physical or verbal assaults on staff members, and more likely to be injured. Yet jail officers are not trained, to be mental health specialists, right? And unfortunately, in jails, one can find the same type of unethical behavior that one finds with police and prison officers. Jail officers can be uncaring and insensitive to human needs. So you have, all of these different issues that you're kind of dealing with in these different types of, discretionary situations and dilemmas. So that they experience a lot of the same things. And even when you talk about treatment staff, a very unique issue facing correctional treatment professionals kind of derives from their dual goals of treating the person and being the employee of the state with a corresponding duty to maintain safety and security. So, the ethical issues for treatment professionals have grown as the number of inmates in both prisons and jails with serious mental problems increase as well. And mentally ill prisoners make up really over 10% of the population in these facilities, and some say it's even higher. And I would tend to agree that it would be much, much higher. And again, this presents an enormous problem for both correctional officers and treatment staff. So the professional goal of all treatment specialists would be to kind of help their client. And this goal may be fundamentally inconsistent with that punitive part, right? Because prisons, jails, they are supposed to be punitive in a sense, but they're also supposed to be rehabilitative, right? So you have this inconsistency there. So a dilemma of, treatment programs is deciding really who gets to participate, and do I really get to kind of pick and choose on who I want to participate. So there is a little bit of a dilemma there as well. And psychiatrists in corrections may feel that they are being used more for social control than treatment. The most prevalent issue is how to maintain one's commitment to a helping profession while being in an environment that does not value the goals and mission of treatment, right? And again, that's kind of an interesting dynamic when you talk about treatment versus correction staff. So, in an online resource for treatment staff, there were some ethical principles that were basically identified. So I thought it'd be good to kind of take a look at some of these. Do not harm, respect people as ends, do what's best for everyone under the circumstances, don't abuse or exploit participants, don't intervene unless you're competent in that particular area. Actively strive to improve the program, maintain confidentiality. Disclosure can be important, and be concerned with conflicts of interest. So these are some things that are really important as it relates to treatment staff. Now we're going to kind of switch gears a little bit and talk about community corrections. And if you want to read all of those other things that I kind of went over, I didn't go into super great detail. You can go back to page 384 and 385, and it gives you a little bit more by definition, talking about, again, do no harm, respect people as ends, do what's best for everyone under the circumstances, don't abuse or exploit participants, strive to improve the program, maintain confidentiality of clients, disclosure is important, and be concerned with conflict. Those are all further discussed on page 384 and 385. So now we're going to move towards something that we call community corrections. So community corrections is basically a term that encompasses halfway houses, work release centers, probation, parole, and other intermediate sanctions, things like electronic monitoring. And it has a more positive and helpful image than institutional corrections, if you will. Okay. Ethical dilemmas for probation and parole officers basically revolve around promoting rehabilitation for the client and security for the community. So it really is important that we understand what directions community corrections is going in. So even in this subsystem, if you will, of the criminal justice system, the ideals of justice and care become a little bit diluted by bureaucratic mismanagement and personal agendas. And we'll talk a little bit about some statistics here. The Bureau of Justice Statistics reports that there were about 870,500 parolees in 2015, as opposed to 3,789,800 probationers. So you can really see that there's a lot of probation and prison, right? And there are reasons for both, and I have a link to probation and parole in the United States in 2019, and we'll talk a little bit more about this as we go into the next couple of minutes here. So, discretion in probation exists at the point of sentencing. Probation officers make recommendations to judges concerning whether the offender should be sent to prison or to be monitored on probation, and the number of years to be served, if you will. And discretion, kind of exists in the following ways. Probation officers decide when to file violations. It applies in and during recommendations to the judge in revoking, someone's probation or parole, so revocation hearings, and also decisions regarding people on their caseload. So, again, we're talking about probation in this particular instance. Now, parole board members, on the other hand, or their designees, they make decisions regarding release. And parole officers have the same discretion in managing their caseload that probation officers do. And what criteria then do they use? Well, usually the risk to the public is their primary factor. And some other factors as it relates to parole could be the type of crime, family ties, crowding in the institution, who the victim might have been, what the judge wants, and then the publicity of the crime itself. So these are some things that kind of come into play as well. But usually, the risk to the public is the primary factor for decision making on the part of probation or on probation and parole officials. So it's important to kind of look at that. And then we talked a little bit about some of the other factors. So probation and parole officers have been described as adopting different roles on the job. Kind of recall the typologies that were offered how to describe police officers in their approach to the job and how their type might be, right? And how that type might affect their decisions. Well, the same apply to probation and parole officers, right? So you have a typology. We have a culture. So here we have the punitive law officer or law enforcer. And this is the officer who perceives the role as one of enforcer, enforces every rule, goes by the book. You have the kind of the welfare or therapeutic practitioner, the officer who perceives the role as one of counselor to the offender and who might, help to affect that rehabilitative change. You have the passive time server, the officer who does the bare minimum on the job to kind of stay out of trouble. And then you have the kind of the combined model, and that would be all of them. And then it wouldn't be, one thing we want to talk about as it relates to probation and parole would be caseload supervision. So discretion exists not only at the recommendation to release stage, but also throughout supervision. And officers do not make the decision to revoke, but they do make the decision to file that violation report and make a recommendation to the judge or to the parole hearing examiner. And the decision to write a violation report is a very powerful element in the control the officer has over the offender. But this can obviously be a difficult decision to make, at times, and to violate somebody. If the officer excuses a serious violation and the decision to do so is based on, let's say, favoritism, fear, bribery, or whatever, that officer then is putting the community at risk and is basically unethical in their thinking. Now, if the person makes a simple mistake, that's a little bit different. Personal relationships, as I said, of any type, platonic, financial, romantic, etc., are simply not appropriate. All right. So now let's kind of, as we're getting closer to finishing up, let's talk about parole officers. So, we've discussed probation and parole officers simultaneously, but, let's take a little kind of an important look at some of the distinctions between the two. Okay. So supervision of parole officers is stronger than probation officers. The parole officer usually manages a caseload of older and more seasoned offenders, right? Because they've done some time. Those that have longer criminal records, so the offender officer relationship is a little bit different. And also the problems faced by those on parole those are going to be a little bit different than those on probation as well. So one Bureau of Justice Statistics, BJS study tracked a little over 404,000 prisoners in 30 states after their release from prison in 2005. And what they found in this study is that 2/3, 67% basically, were rearrested within 3 years. 76% were rearrested within 5 years. And more than half, 56%, were rearrested within the first year. So the term that we're talking about here is called recidivism. And what that basically means is someone that kind of bounces in and out of jail, if you will. Okay, and I have a link to that study if you want to watch it. And again, we're talking about parole and probation. So there are some similarities, but there are some differences. When it comes to things like halfway houses, the ethical issues concerning halfway houses are a combination of those that confront the institutional corrections and those seen in community corrections. Halfway houses can be large institutions, and staff may actually begin to feel like correctional officers even though they're not. Halfway houses staff members look to balance the rights of the offenders against the safety concerns of the community. So these are not sworn officers or prisoner staff or jail officers. They're basically civilian individuals that run these halfway houses. Probation, parole, and halfway houses have seen their numbers rise. And halfway houses are basically less expensive than prisons, right? But they don't have the security that prisons have as well. And then what kind of comes into play here also would be something called privatization. It's very, kind of problematic because profit motives are also present. So when you privatize something, it's typically for profit versus when it's state run or when it's federal run. Okay, so that's going to kind of wrap us up for our part 2, if you will, of chapter 12. And I appreciate you hanging with me. I know there's a lot of terms and a lot of things that make it difficult to kind of understand, but don't forget to use the kind of the key terms matching exercise to help you with some of the definitions, and I'm sure that'll kind of get you through. So with that being said, again, this will conclude part 2 of chapter 12, discretion and dilemmas in corrections.